Welcome to Capitol View on WSIU. I'm Jeff Williams, sitting in this week as we take a look at what's making news around the state in Illinois politics. Well, the leading candidates vying for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate squared off in their first debate. We're going to take a closer look, plus probably a couple of other stories, this week on Capitol View. And to help lead our discussion are Dan Petrella, political writer for the Chicago Tribune, and Kent Redfield, political science professor emeritus from the University of Illinois, Springfield. Gentlemen, welcome back to the program.
Morning.
Glad to be here.
Well, earlier this week, the leading three candidates in the race for the Democratic U.S. Senate nomination held their first live broadcast debate featuring Congresswoman Robin Kelly, Congressman Raja Krishnamurthy, and Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton. They took part in a forum hosted by WBEZ on Monday. I think it's probably the first time most voters have probably seen them, at least these three candidates, in the same room at the same time. Dan, I know you were there. How would you assess this first public meeting of these candidates?
Yeah, it was an interesting night. It was at the International House on the campus of the University of Chicago and down in Hyde Park on the south side. And it was very clear from the start that the Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton to use a bad cliche, came out swinging in the debate. She really went aggressively after her opponents, particularly Congressman Krishnamurthy, who is the perceived frontrunner in the race based on the fact that he is one of the most prodigious fundraisers in all of Congress and has been airing TV ads since the summer. And so it was very heated from her part. Congressman Krishnamurthy even sort of quipped as an aside at one point that he should have brought body armor with him to the debate. Her campaign even had a digital billboard outside the venue criticizing the congressman for some of his campaign contributors. So she was very clearly trying to stake her own lane, try to differentiate herself from the two other candidates with more Washington experience in the race. On a lot of policy issues, there's not much daylight between the three candidates, but Lieutenant Governor Stratton was trying very hard and very aggressively to point out and distinguish those places where there is some difference on their positions, particularly on issues related to campaign finance and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency and other issues like that.
Mm-hmm. So Dan or Kent, either one, an event like this with these, at least with these three front runners, what is there any one of them that has potentially something to gain or potentially something that they can lose as a result of these debates? We never know exactly what's going to happen or come out whenever these things happen. But who has the most to gain and most to potentially lose in this series of debates that are coming up?
Well, I think this, if you look at the one, professional poll we've had recently, you still got about 46% of the electorate that is undecided. These are not well-known names, even though the lieutenant governor has been lieutenant governor for 7 years. She essentially held office, was a state rep for 2 years, and then was picked out of, at the time, people were saying, relative obscurity to be Governor Pritzker's lieutenant governor. And, it's pretty clear from at right now that, she doesn't have a huge statewide presence. You would think that being elected twice to statewide office, that would be a difference. Krishnamurthy, we're talking $30 million, sounds like a lot, isn't probably a lot in terms of kind of, competitive general elections, but he's been the voice that's been out there, and he's, people can, if you watch television, and you've got some name recognition. I think the one that probably has the biggest hill to climb is Representative or Congressperson Kelly. That she really is not known. Now, again, in a Democratic primary, 19% of the vote comes from downstate. So, these are the candidates you'd expect to have. But, it's at this point visibility so that people know you're running, and then viability. People have some sense that you're up to the job. And so, Stratton certainly did what you intended in terms of kind of being the name that was at the, for the first name mentioned. But, this is, pretty early in the game. But though that's the problem right now is getting people known, that they've got to recognize a name and then something to associate with the name.
I want just to note at this point that there are also 7 other Democrats in the race that were not included in Monday's debate based on polling. They're Steve Botsford, Sean Brown, Owisi Bustos, Jonathan Dean, Brian Maxwell, Kevin Ryan, and Christopher Swan. It's probably safe to say that most voters have not heard much from these particular candidates. At this point in the campaign, and I don't think they're going to be included in the ABC 7 debate that's going to be going on in Chicago on Thursday, the same day that this program airs. At this point, are their campaigns perfunctory, or does one of these other 7 candidates have a chance of playing spoiler in this Democratic primary?
Well, I wouldn't say they're perfunctory. I mean, I know particularly you mentioned Kevin Ryan has been going around the state on a bus. I think has maybe at this point visited all 102 counties of the state. So certainly at least some of them are putting some effort into this race. But I think it speaks to the difficulty, in a wide open primary like this of breaking through when you are not, already a statewide office holder or a member of Congress. Just the amount of funding that it takes to run a Senate campaign. Even the lieutenant governor who's been in office for 7 years, like Ken said, has struggled somewhat to raise funds. Now we're going to see at the end of the month the quarterly disclosures covering the end of the year, and also from an outside super PAC that's supporting her that suddenly has gone up with TV commercials, despite the fact that they have yet to report any fundraising. But we'll see what they received in the last quarter of 2025. And that is presumably going to be at least some money from Governor Pritzker into that super PAC, because it's his former deputy campaign manager who's running it, his former governor's side and campaign side press secretary and communications director who's handling communications for that super PAC. So, there's a lot of resources behind these other campaigns, and it's really hard, especially in the Senate race where you have to run statewide to do it on sort of the grassroots level. And, I think obviously social media and the way campaigns are run online now has changed things a bit, but I still think it's incredibly hard to break through and get attention for your campaign when you're not either somebody who already has experience in public office or somebody who has the independent means to really build your own platform.
Mm-hmm. Do you think, are we to the point in this Democratic primary for U.S. Senate where at this point we have the 3 top contenders there? Is it the point of who's going to end up spending the most money in the long run as we close in on the March primary?
Money is, it's necessary but not sufficient. People with money always beat people that don't have any money. But beyond that, it's a threshold thing. You've got to have enough money, name recognition, endorsement, issue, something that gets you, to the point where you kind of break through. And the easiest way in the modern campaign, and as political parties have become much, much weaker, is to be able to self-fund or to have some really wealthy friends. In the old days, we'd be talking about who the state Democratic Party or the Cook County Party had slated, and then who the Democratic Party had gotten together in Springfield and ratified that endorsement. That used to be pretty much the primary. Now, when that died, I think Phil Rock was slated by the party and ran like 3rd or 4th, and when Paul Simon got the nomination. So money is important, but it is more what gets you out there.
Mm-hmm. Dan, I wanted to ask, since you saw the debate, observed the debate on Monday, was there something that you saw that was new or a different aspect of these three front runners that may be new to those in the voting public that either tuned in or watched the YouTube feed?
One thing that stood out to me, and this is something a broader issue that's standing out among Democrats now, is the approach to ICE and the slogan of abolishing ICE. You've seen sort of a bifurcation where you have folks like the lieutenant governor who are fully embracing this slogan of abolish ICE, and then you have others like Congressman Krishnamurthy and Congresswoman Kelly, who are sort of using a phrase or some version of the phrase abolish Trump's ICE. So they're saying we shouldn't throw out the agency altogether, but we need to sort of pull back on what the Trump administration is doing with that agency now. And it's really an interesting distinction. And interestingly enough, Governor Pritzker, who is one of Lieutenant Governor Stratton's most vocal supporters in the Senate campaign, is on the abolish Trump's ICE side of that divide, where Congressman Krishnamurthy is versus where his lieutenant governor is on the abolish ICE side. It also gets into a whole question about the logistics of how you would actually do that and who would handle those responsibilities. And I asked the lieutenant governor about that after the debate on Monday, and she said, well, there's still Border Patrol. We still need to protect our borders. But it's actually Border Patrol that has been responsible for some of the most egregious oversteps that have happened in these crackdowns here in Chicago and in Minneapolis. It was Border Patrol who shot Alex Preddy in Minneapolis. So, ICE has been the focal point of people's rage and ire, but it's really, several agencies within the Department of Homeland Security that have been involved, and not always ICE that's responsible for the most, jarring things that we've seen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Again, these three candidates will be right back in action on an ABC7 Chicago debate that's taking place on Thursday. Dan, is there anything you expect to see that maybe come out different now they've already had a warm-up, that now this is the second one in a matter of a week?
Yeah, what I'll be watching for is whether the lieutenant governor ratchets back the sort of the attack mode that she was in on Monday night a little bit, or whether she continues to go hard, particularly at Congressman Krishnamurthy, and whether her opponents go after her a little more aggressively than they did in the first meeting. They were sort of happy to brush aside the criticisms or explain, where maybe there was some gray area in some of the criticisms that she was lobbing at them. And, there is the idea that if you're explaining, you're losing in politics. But, I think that in the room and on the stream, the lieutenant governor came across as, very aggressive. And I think there's a way to look at that as their campaign perceives themselves as running from behind in the race, and they need to do something to differentiate themselves and gain attention from Congressman Krishnamurthy, especially, who, as I said, has raised a lot of money, has a lot of big name endorsements, and just has probably at this point pretty high name recognition just based on everybody seeing his face every time they turn on their TV to watch a sporting event or a late night TV show or something like that.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I also want to make note, I think it's important to note, that there is a Republican part of this U.S. Senate primary race. There are 6 Republican candidates that are running for the GOP nomination, including, as we mentioned, I think Don Tracy, Carrie Capoletti, Casey Klebeck, Ginny Evans, Pamela Davis Long, and Jimmy Lee Tillman II. I don't believe they've held any sort of statewide or live or broadcast debate forum yet, but I guess, Kent, how would you handicap the Republican side of this primary race for U.S. Senate?
Well, it begins with the fact that Republicans hold no statewide office in Illinois, which is, one place that you go looking for a candidate. They only have 3 of the 17 members of Congress are Republicans, and all of those are deep Southern Illinois districts. And so, probably the most prominent name that was put forth would be, Congressman LaHood. And he's in a situation where, he's got a strong base within Congress. He's on important committees, and that looks a lot, running for a pretty safe reelection looked a lot more attractive than going up against a Democrat in a overwhelmingly Democratic state. And so I suspect that the Republicans will put enough money and effort behind Tracy, who's the former state Republican chairman, so that they won't end up with some kind of embarrassment where they've got a candidate that runs on save the whales and suddenly catches lightning in a bottle. So I don't expect, we're trying to make it respectable, which is not a great position to be in. And there's no national money. Nobody wants to come in and flip any of the seats or positions that the Democrats hold in Illinois.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to talk about a little bit, touch on what we're looking at in terms of voter turnout, both primary and the general. Republican gubernatorial candidate Darren Bailey and his running mate Aaron Delmar have been going across the state, and one of the things they've been talking about, at least they talked about down here in southern Illinois, one of their stops, was getting a GOP voter turnout. And I think they were probably looking more at the general election, the primary, but they were talking about the need to get 50 to 55% of Republican voter turnout downstate in order to try and counteract the Democratic vote in Chicago for Republicans to be successful statewide. As you kind of look at the election calculus for 2026 in Illinois, any predictions or estimates on what we might see in terms of turnout, both on the Republican and Democratic sides, and how important is that going to be ultimately in whatever the outcomes are in 26?
Well, I somewhat understand the point that they're trying to make about turnout, but something to keep in mind is, the other side will also be trying very hard to turn out all their voters. And we saw, for example, between the 2020 and 2024 presidential election years, the top of the Democratic ticket fall off by about 400,000 votes, if I remember correctly. So there's a whole lot of Democrats who sometimes don't show up too. So, I'm sure the Democratic Party of Illinois, with lots of money from Governor Pritzker, will be working very, very hard on a get out the vote campaign. So I think it's just the demographics and the population trends in Illinois are very hard for Republicans right now. And, it depends on whether they find candidates that are able to sort of appeal to more independent voters in the suburbs, or maybe some more, middle of the road voters who lean Democratic in the suburbs and things like that. I think it's going to be a very tough year for Republicans across the country, frankly, but particularly in a deep blue state like Illinois, if, with everything that's going on with the economy and the unpopularity of the president's immigration tactics right now. So, I think it's going to be interesting to see how Republican candidates running in Illinois embrace those things, particularly when we get to the general election, or try to distance themselves from those things. Kent mentioned Darren LaHood earlier, who, he even put out a statement after the shooting in Minnesota over the weekend, speaking up for people's First and Second Amendment rights and saying that we need answers about what happened, and people should not be at risk when they're exercising their constitutional rights. So you're starting to see a little daylight there between the president and some Republicans on certain issues. So I think it's a very tough hill to climb for Republicans in Illinois right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Donald Trump got about 2,000 more votes in 2024 than he did in 2020. And so it is the Democrats, there are lots of reasons why they stayed home. There are lots of reasons for them to go and vote in this election. And I don't see what's driving the Republican electorate to come out to the polls. I mean, they really are in a defensive mode, and obviously a lot can change between now and November. But if the Republicans have a couple more weeks like the last couple of weeks, they're going to be in really bad shape in terms of getting beyond their base, which is, will show up. But so it's likely to look more like, the last couple of general elections rather than the most recent one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Gentlemen, we've got about 5.5 or so minutes left, so I just kind of wanted to do a check-in on the spring legislative session. It's underway. Lawmakers held a few sessions this month. I believe the Senate is back in session next month, the 1st of February, and there's not been a lot of substantial work yet, but I know that the deadline for bill introduction is coming up next week, and then of course we've got the governor's budget address coming up. I believe that's on the 18th of February. Now, we've talked before about how this is going to be a difficult budget year. IBHE is already out with, I think it's a $2.7 billion budget request they have for FY27. I think it's something like 4.5% increase in general revenue they're wanting. Of course, we've got the backdrop of the federal cuts in Medicaid and other health funding. How tense is this budget process getting for state agencies for this legislative session?
I think it's going to be a very tough year, and the indication already in the current year that runs through the end of June, the governor is holding back almost half a billion dollars in funding from the budget. Out of they're trying to blame, and probably with a lot of credibility, blaming the Trump administration and federal cuts and uncertainty at the economy for some of that. But I think it's also an indication of difficult times ahead. I think we're going to see a lot of fights over programs that folks want to fund or want to increase funding for, higher education, for example, that there's not going to be money for unless we get into conversation about ways to bring in some more revenue, which is something that is a perennial conversation in Springfield. But since 2020, when the governor tried and failed to amend the Constitution to do the graduated income tax, there haven't been any real substantive looks at overhauling the state's revenue streams. And I think there's some talk, even House Speaker Chris Welch has alluded to this millionaire tax idea that folks have endorsed on the ballot in non-binding referendums. But the question is whether they want to put that on the ballot in November as a constitutional amendment in an election year, and whether that would help or hurt Democrats who are also on the ballot, including the governor, in the fall.
Kent?
Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty because there are things within the reconciliation, the big beautiful bill that the Republicans put through and the president signed, that are going to phase in over the next 2 or 3 years, involving federal income taxes, and that will hurt Illinois' bottom line. We can decouple from some of these things, but we try to make our income tax structure similar, both business and private, so that it's not, we're not overwhelming people with, how all of these differences between the two systems. And so they're just, there are the threats of freezes and withholding grant money that has already been promised. That drama just makes everybody very, very cautious about getting too far out above, over their skis. It would not surprise me at all that we have to come in and they'll put something through that will balance. They have in, however you define balance, but they have to do it, by the 30th of May or 31st of May. It wouldn't surprise me if we're doing a lot of budget work when they come back from the election in the fall veto. I think it's just too uncertain this time. And that crowds out everything else. Nobody wants to do anything controversial. If you've got all your great achievements you've done last year, now you want to run on them. So, they get back in town. I think the House will have only been in session 9 days, and the Senate like 19 before before you have the the primary. And so it's going to be a very crowded time frame, zero information. That's not a good way to make decisions. So we shall see.
All right. About the minute or so we have left, what's on your radar for the coming week or weeks ahead?
Well, I'm going to be continuing to watch both the issues we've really been talking about, sir. I guess all three, the Senate race, immigration enforcement, and the budget. And so I think that's going to take up quite a bit of time going forward. And like Kent said, it's going to be interesting to see how the session shapes up when they get back from the primary in March.
Kent, anything of interest?
Yeah, I don't, I just, it's going to be hard to do anything substantive, and everything else is the budget. So, and we can do performative kinds of things, take positions, and that's worth something in campaigns. Doesn't do much for public policy.
Kent, I'll let you have the last word. We are out of time for this edition of Capitol View. For Dan Petrella, Chicago Tribune, and Kent Redfield, University of Illinois Springfield, I'm Jeff Williams. Thank you for joining us this week for Capitol View. Have a good week.